combating nutrition disinformation and general bull. It's Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another Instagram Live, and we're here with another Jimmy Rants episode for you. And if you're brand new to Jimmy Rants, what we do here is I like to rant all about things regarding nutritional health. So we start off on Instagram Live, and all the wonderful peoples that come in down there, I talk to them here in just a minute, but we start there so the people that are here live get to see this on Instagram. I try to get on generally a couple times a day at the most, sometimes just once a day, but we get on Instagram Live, then it's on the replay for 24 hours. You can watch the replay there 24 hours. Then we head on over to YouTube and put the video on there. So if you type in Jimmy Rants, 2 different words, it'll be in all caps when you see it pop up, and you can see the past rants. And then we have a brand new Jimmy Rants podcast that you can access wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you listen. We have a Jimmy Rants podcast, which has the best of the best snippets from these here Jimmy Rants. So today's Jimmy Rants topic is all about something that is about to get a whole lot of media attention over the next couple of years. Because every 5 years, the government sends out their, I guess, eagle eyes to go find scientists to put together on what's called an advisory committee for the United States Department of Agriculture and their dietary guidelines for Americans. These come out every 5 years. They have since 1980. Every 5 years, we've gotten brand new dietary guidelines for Americans. And they supposedly bring together all the scientists, the top in their field, to come up with conclusions about what is healthy in your nutrition. And it sounds all good on paper, and most Americans believe that what they get from the USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans is the most vetted out science that they can possibly find when it comes to how they should feed themselves in order to be healthy. But I'm going to give you a little hint. They're not even close. I would argue that the United States Department of Agriculture's Dietary Guidelines for Americans is not just unscientific, but they're also irrational. And I'm being very kind when I say these words. And I don't say them without knowing the ramifications of the weight of saying that they're both unscientific and irrational. So here's what happens, you guys. So every 5 years, the President of the United States is able to have whoever the current president is. They're able to have the United States Department of Agriculture secretary, so the agricultural secretary, they choose a panel of people to be on this advisory committee. So what the advisory committee does, supposedly, is they pour over all the latest scientific research when it comes to nutritional health, and then they start creating recommendations for the USDA to make guidelines that would then become the nutritional law of the land. That's what the Dietary Guidelines for All Americans is. The last one was in 2015. The one before that was 2010, one before that 2005. So every 5 years. And the next one coming up in 2 years is 2020. Well, they'll be deliberating this over the next couple of years, and it's going to be more of the same. Because none of the advisory committee members will be people that, for example, at least understand the science behind a ketogenic diet. And with all the attention on low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diets, and before that, all the attention on paleo type of diets, incorporating more real whole foods, you would think that the science would be included in there. You would think that some of the leading voices and leading thinkers and researchers out there that understand all the ins and outs of various parts of nutrition and their impact on your health, you would think all of those people would end up on this advisory committee. Nope. It ends up being basically industry hacks. So the people that they put on the advisory committees, if you ever look up their credentials and their where they have to release any ties that they have to companies, a lot of them have ties to food companies that peddle grains. A lot of them have ties to pharmaceutical companies. A lot of them have ties to the very industries that they're pushing the foods that they're pushing. So vegetable oils is a prime example. So that is why I believe, since the USDA's Dietary Guidelines for Americans is both unscientific and irrational, and I'm being very kind, that whatever comes out of this 2020 Dietary Guidelines, whatever comes up with it, and they've made incremental changes each time, but it's just so slight little changes that don't really get to the mainstream of people like you and me. So I think we, as a collective society, and if you're watching this right now, you're one of those people that, okay, I've been trusting the government to tell me what's right when it comes to diet. And they've let you down, right? You're still obese. You're still dealing with chronic disease. You're still having issues in the diet. And quite frankly, you don't really like having to eat whole grains and having to eat low fat and having to eat lean meats and all of the things that they tell you is supposed to be healthy. Nobody actually likes that. Even the most ardent low-fat dieters will tell you they're not loving that low-fat diet. They're not loving their, what they're having to eat in their diet in order to eat that way. Wouldn't you like to have delicious food that is both delicious and nutritious? And that's what keto's done for me. Now, I will tell you that in 2010, I got to testify before this committee in Washington, D.C. It was the United States Department of Agriculture's Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee. And I stood up, there was 40-something, like 46 people there that day giving testimony. And of the 46, there were exactly 2 people that were average, everyday people. One of them was the very first lady. She was a real food advocate and talked about shopping at farmers markets and how we should incorporate more real whole foods into our diet. She was number 1. And then I was number like 20-something as a speaker. And I got up there and just poured my heart out that, I did everything that you told me to do and it didn't work. So then I decided to do the opposite of everything you told me to do. And that did help me get healthier. And I think we need to come up with a plan that would allow for multiple modalities when it comes to diet. So if someone feels good eating a vegan diet, you should have a vegan diet option. If someone feels good doing a ketogenic type of approach, I think you need to have a ketogenic thing. If somebody wants to do more of a Mediterranean style diet, that should be an option as well. If someone wants to do more of a Dean Ornish, John McDougall low-fat diet, there should be an option. Give people options, and then they pick and choose the one that's right for them. But that's not what's happening right now. What's happening right now is we're having political hacks, so to speak, on these nutritional councils saying, oh, well, we've got to honor all of these people that we're advisory to their companies. So all the vegetable oil companies, we can't disparage vegetable oil companies, all the whole grain company. We can't disparage them. There's too much vested interest in there, so we can't disparage them at all, or we might lose our seat on their council. So that's the kind of games that I don't think the average American even understands about the dietary guidelines, is that they're totally a trumped up hack job, so to speak. And they're not actually based on any science, and they're really not rational. I mean, does it make any sense at all with what we know about the role that fat plays in our metabolism? Does it make any sense at all that we're telling people to eat less fat? How are you supposed to absorb the key fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K? How are you supposed to be satiated? How are you supposed to have all the functions in the body that the brain thrives on with fat, especially that noggin up there? Remember, we talked about this before on other Jimmy Rants. 70% of your brain is made up of fat. And yet the USDA Dietary Guidelines for Americans says, cut your fat down. Now, I will give them credit. In the last update, they made 2 provisions that I thought were a move in the right direction, but a very slow move. One, they said dietary cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern. Did you know that? Most Americans are clueless that the dietary guidelines in 2015 totally removed all the restrictions on cholesterol. Everything about restrict cholesterol, restrict cholesterol, restrict cholesterol in your diet, all up until 2015. Then they're like, hey, it's not really a dietary concern anymore. Have all the cholesterol you want. I would dare say most Americans don't know that. The other thing that they did was they didn't put a limit on saturated fat anymore. Used to, they limited saturated fat to something like 10% of your calories. Now they just say generally restrict fat, but it's not necessary to restrict saturated fat to below 10% like they used to recommend. So these are things that they're moving slowly in the right direction, and maybe with the 2020, they'll go a little further. But at the end of the day, they're still pushing lean meats. They're still pushing lentils and legumes and beans and all of this nonsense, quinoa, all this nonsense that is not at all healthy, especially for the vast majority of Americans, and I would say people around the world, that are dealing with this condition called insulin resistance. And so until they recognize that and realize that the multiple options thing is probably what's needed more than this one-size-fits-all diet, there is no one-size-fits-all diet. There's this thing called bioindividuality, and the sooner we teach people about that each individual has to find the diet that's right for them, the sooner they learn that, then the sooner they'll be able to get on the pathway to health. I'm not saying keto's for everybody. I'm not saying veganism's for everybody. I'm not saying paleo, real food is for everybody. I'm not saying that Mediterranean or even a low-fat diet is for everybody. But one of those is right for you. And we're just not getting that from the USDA and the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So, to recap, they're unscientific because they're not showing all the science. They're irrational because some of those people that would try the diet that they promote will get less healthy in the end. And that's the dirty little secret they don't want you to know about. And of course, some people make the argument, well, we don't need to worry about the dietary guidelines. Everybody ignores them anyway. No, no, no. You fall into the trap if you believe that. While it's true most Americans probably don't pay attention to it, let me tell you the ramifications of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. They show up in school lunches. So whenever your kids go to school and they make the lunch, they're following the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Did you know that? When they went military bases, when they serve food there, it's all based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Welfare recipients, did you know that a lot of what they're allowed to purchase on welfare is based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans? I could go down a whole list of all of these, ripple effects of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans that reaches into our culture and hits a whole lot of people. So you and I might be ignoring it, and that's all well and good, but it's almost, you can't ignore it. Let's just put it that way. And doctors then will say, well, we need to eat by the guidelines because those have been vetted out by science. This is something you're going to learn in my Jimmy Rants. I'm not a big fan of what is pushed as science in the nutritional health realm because most of that science is not randomized controlled clinical trials. Most of that science is not applicable necessarily to humans. They're mouse studies. They're other kinds of studies. So I'm not a big fan of those kind of research studies that are cited as a means for promoting what we put in our mouths to eat in order to be healthy. So the bottom line here is, yes, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is put out there every 5 years. No, they're not scientific. No, they make no sense for a lot of people. And no, I don't think we need to be paying much attention to them. And at some point, we want to be able to shift the attention over to people learning on their own what works for them. If the USDA isn't going to do it, then it's going to be left to people like me and you and everyone else who has had our lives changed to help people navigate to find that diet that's right for them. Now, I do want to make mention of one organization called the Nutrition Coalition. NutritionCoalition.org, I believe, is the website. But Nina Teicholz, who wrote this book called The Big Fat Surprise, she started this for, I think it's a 501c3. It's one of those tax-deductible type of organizations that is supposed to be trying to educate and influence the dietary guidelines. And so she's been working on this since the 2015 guidelines came out. She's been working on this project. Go look up nutritioncoalition.org and you'll be able to find all the great information that they're doing to try to change the guidelines. But I still contend we're not going to change them from the inside out. It's going to have to go to a third-party, independent set of scientists, because not once have we ever seen a Dr. Eric Westman, a Dr. Steve Finney, a Dr. Jeff Folek, a Dr. Ken Berry, none of these like leading voices out there that could articulate the science. They've never been allowed to be a part of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Advisory Committee, and to me, that's just a travesty. And until that happens, I'm not trusting a darn thing that they come out with. All right, let me see what you guys have to say. Welcome in, welcome in. Thanks for being here. Let's see, America's getting fatter and sicker. Yeah, Barnyard Coffee. I think the evidence for why the Dietary Guidelines for Americans is bunk. Just look at the statistics of obesity, of diabetes, of heart disease, of cancer. I could go on and on down the line of chronic diseases, and they've all gotten worse since we've all embraced culturally the low-fat diet. Amy Marm Brewster says the Dietary Guidelines is just a payoff for all those who stand to make a profit. And it's hard not to be jaded like that and say it in that way, but you're right. And remember this, the United States Department of Agriculture, what is their role in the government? It's to promote agriculture, right? What is some of the top crops that we grow here in America? It's not spinach. It's not lettuce. And before the E. coli breakout, it's not romaine lettuce. What is it? It's grains, corn, soybeans, all of these kinds of things. And so they're going to try to protect that interest. And again, if you think about it in that terms, the USDA is just protecting its interest, the agricultural industry. It's like telling people, we're going to come up with smoking guidelines to help people quit smoking. Oh, who's coming up with the guidelines? Philip Morris. Does that make any sense at all? No, because they have a vested interest in selling more cigarettes. So are they truly going to tell people how they can quit smoking? Not a chance. And that's the same thing that the USDA is doing, giving us dietary guidelines. They're only doing it to help promote more grain consumption. And the sooner that Americans figure that out, the sooner we'll start getting healthy again. All righty. Hello, Olga. Yes, we did have a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you. Liljegren, do you think these guidelines will ever be genuinely healthy? Well, that's where people like Nina Teicholz are trying to influence them. And I do think if true science is allowed to be a part of it, and if on the advisory panel we have 2 or 3 people that are some of the ones I mentioned earlier, Volek, Finney, Westman, Berry, maybe Dr. Will Cole, any of these people that they understand the science here and that they could articulate it and it actually becomes part of what they conclude. And here's the other thing. The advisory committee, all they do is give advice about what to do. The ultimate decision about what gets published and put out there as the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the ultimate decision is up to the Secretary of Agriculture. That's it. It's disgusting. And Health and Human Services Secretary, I think, is also involved in that as well. but they're the ones that ultimately come up with. All the advisory committee says is, this is what we recommend based on the science. They can really write whatever they want at that point. So will they ever be genuinely healthy? Liljegren, great question. I would argue in the current incarnation of where they are within our government, no. Will they ever become truly, genuinely healthy if they give people options and it becomes this third-party examination of the science and then they share this information with people in an unbiased way? I think then and only then will they be genuinely healthy. But see, here's the thing. Most people in the meantime, with all these bad guidelines coming out, they're getting sicker and sicker, and some are dying because they're not getting the information. It's why people like myself have thrived out here, because I'm sharing information you're simply not going to get from these higher ups. So learn on your own, and I think that is what's going to really change society much more so than anything the government does with nutrition. Fire Wolf Ashton, if they removed restrictions on cholesterol in 2015, the doctors still haven't gotten on board so they can push statins. Well, they push statins because they still look at cholesterol in the blood. What they've removed the restrictions on is cholesterol in the diet. So they used to tell you restrict the amount of cholesterol that you eat. Now they're saying the cholesterol that you eat is not a nutrient of concern, so therefore we're not going to have any restrictions on it. But they still think that cholesterol in the body, in the blood, when they test it, that still matters. So that's why they still push statins. Welcome in, guys. Guerre and Tammy says, it's so sad the USDA is keeping people sick. Well, I'm going to push back on that comment just a little bit. Maybe before the internet, the USDA had a monopoly. But now that the internet is out there and there's information galore, and then some of that information is spilling over into books, I think there's no excuse why people don't understand why those dietary guidelines no longer apply. If you've even paid attention even a little bit and done your own research, the reason why they've had such a monopoly on this information is because people have been way too trusting for far too long. And the sooner we stop trusting what we're told and instead start looking into things from a different angle, even if you don't conclude that the different angle is right, at least hear other arguments and hear out, like what I'm sharing here today, that the dietary guidelines is unscientific and irrational. Hear out people that have an alternative view, and then you might go, well, dang, I never thought about it that way. But you're right. At the end of the day, they are keeping people sick, but I do think people can and should take back control of their own health with the information they're learning on the internet. Lau Misha says, unfortunately, profit weighs more than people's health. Yeah, and it's not just the USDA that's doing that. Doctors are doing that. A lot of them are. So many aspects of the food industry, they're doing that. They're promoting things as healthy when they themselves know they're not healthy at all. Hello, Shearston. Hello, Kimberly. Welcome in. Welcome in. Shearston says, always follow the money. And it's sad that we have to, but you're right. There is moolah to be made off of selling grains to people. And anyway, thankfully, so many of us, if you're watching me here live on Instagram, or if you're watching the replay on Instagram or on YouTube, or you're listening to the Jimmy Rants podcast, these are all people that get it. You've already understood this. What we're all trying to do collectively is change the people that are loved ones in our life, to get them to understand. So family members, friends, coworkers, these are the people that need this information, and they're simply not getting it for some reason. And they're seeing the USDA come out with dietary guidelines for Americans, and they think, oh, wow, these are well vetted. These are the best of the best recommendations for nutrition, and they're anything but that. All right, guys, that's it for this Jimmy Rants. Head on over to jimmyrants.com if you want to access any of the ways to be a part of this show. We start off on Instagram Live, so go follow me at Livin' Low Carb Man on Instagram. And then if you missed the live, you can watch the replay for 24 hours. Then we pop it on over to YouTube, where you can watch all of the replays of the Jimmy Rants. And then we have a Jimmy Rants podcast that now airs if you want to hop on to your favorite podcasting channel, and you can access all of the podcasts. We try to put up 1 or 2 a day on the podcast, and it's a whittled down version of these Jimmy Rants with a nice music bed underneath. I think you'll enjoy it if you go check it out. Olga says there's a health credits questionnaire that I have to fill out each year. It asks how many servings of grains we eat. They are looking for a high number, and I hate having to lie about what I do eat and don't. Yeah, I've taken not that specific survey, but ones regarding health questions, and they always say, you know, are you getting your 8 to 10 servings of healthy whole grains? And yeah, if you don't want to get dinged, you have to lie on that. So it's really sad. But again, that kind of thing is all based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. That's why they're unscientific. It's why they're irrational. And it's why we need to just keep on ignoring them. JimmyRants.com, you guys. Pop over there. And until the next time, we'll see you then.